Something inside you has already begun to shift, though you may not yet recognize its form. The empathic sensitivity you have carried, the very trait you believed defined your essence, has started to reveal itself as something other than what you were told. You feel it, do you not? A stirring beneath the exhaustion, a question forming in the depths where questions were once forbidden. This is not collapse. This is the psyche preparing for transformation. What I'm about to reveal will challenge the narrative you have constructed around your sensitivity. But more importantly, it will expose the function that victimhood has served in your psychological economy. The patterns you attribute to your empathic nature, the draining encounters, the magnetic pull toward those who take, the chronic depletion, these are not the inevitable price of feeling deeply. They are symptoms of a position you have occupied, a role the unconscious adopted long ago when sovereignty felt too dangerous to claim. According to my research into the empathic personality structure, what presents as heightened sensitivity is often the psyche's compensatory response to early wounding. The child who could not control their environment learned instead to read it with extraordinary precision. The nervous system that could not ensure safety through power developed radar for emotional weather systems. This is not weakness. This is the intelligence of adaptation. Through years of studying the unconscious, one pattern emerged repeatedly. The so-called empath often carries an inflated identification with the helper archetype, while the shadow accumulates material around power, anger, and self-preservation. You learned that your value resided in your capacity to absorb, to soothe, to understand. And so the psyche organized itself around this principle, developing exquisite attunement to others, while your own needs descended into darkness. But here is what the conscious mind cannot yet see. Every identity the ego inflates creates an equal and opposite force in the shadow. The more you identified as the one who gives, the more your capacity to receive atrophied. The more you believed yourself incapable of harm, the more your healthy aggression turned inward or emerged in passive, unconscious ways. The victim position, comfortable as it has become, serves a function you have not yet seen. It protects you from the terrifying responsibility of your own power. The transformation from victim to victor is not a matter of willpower or positive thinking. It is a psychological process that moves through distinct stages, each requiring the integration of shadow material the ego has refused to acknowledge. What I discovered through analytical work is that this journey follows a pattern as old as consciousness itself. The hero's descent into the underworld, the retrieval of what was lost, the return transformed. You stand now at the beginning of this journey. The exhaustion you feel is not merely the result of others taking from you, it is the psyche's rebellion against a role that has outlived its purpose. The unconscious will not permit you to continue in a position that denies your wholeness, and so it creates symptoms, fatigue, resentment, illness, sudden withdrawals from relationships, anything to force consciousness to turn and look at what has been avoided. The first stage emerges when you begin to notice the patterns of exhaustion follow a predictable cycle. You find yourself drawn again and again to individuals who require rescue, who present as wounded in ways that call to something ancient in your psyche. In the beginning, you believed this was evidence of your compassionate nature. You told yourself that your willingness to help where others would turn away made you somehow more evolved, more spiritual, more awakened to suffering. But depth psychology reveals a different truth. What appears as compassion is often the ego's attempt to maintain a position of superiority through service. The helper feels needed, yes, but also safe. The one who gives need never acknowledge their own hunger. The one who rescues need never confront their own helplessness. Your empathy, pure as it felt, carried within it a subtle inflation. You were the strong one, the capable one, the one who could bear what others could not. Watch what happens in your body when someone fails to appreciate your efforts. Notice the contraction, the quiet rage that emerges when your sacrifice goes unrecognized. This reaction reveals the unconscious contract you give in order to receive validation, proof of your worth, evidence that you matter. But worth that depends on constant giving is not worth at all. It is a prison disguised as purpose. The first stage of transformation requires that you see this pattern without judgment, that you acknowledge the ways your empathy has served your ego's need to feel valuable through service. The second transformation occurs when you recognize that your empathy has become a sophisticated form of control. This revelation disturbs the self-image, and so the ego resists it fiercely. How could sensitivity be manipulation? How could caring be control? Yet the unconscious operates in ways the conscious mind refuses to see. What emerged from decades of observation is this: when you absorb another's emotional state, when you attune so completely to their inner world that your own disappears, you believe you are being selfless. But examine the mechanism more closely. By making yourself indispensable, by becoming the one who understands, who feels, who knows what others need before they speak it, you create dependency. And dependency, however unconscious, is a form of power. The empath who prides themselves on reading rooms, on knowing what others feel, has inverted the power dynamic while maintaining the appearance of submission. You need not assert yourself directly. Your sensitivity does it for you. You need not state your needs. Your exhaustion communicates them. You need not establish boundaries. Your eventual collapse creates them through crisis. This is the shadow speaking, the anger you were taught to suppress, the selfishness you learned to deny, the healthy narcissism required for individuation. All of this has been operating beneath awareness, shaping your relationships in ways you have refused to acknowledge. You chose empathy not only because you are sensitive, but because it allowed you to remain close to others while never risking true intimacy. To truly be seen would require you to stop managing, to stop caretaking, to stop using your attunement as a shield against your own vulnerability. When this recognition arrives, shame often follows. The ego recoils from the revelation that its virtue carried such complex motivation. But this is not a reason for self-punishment. This is the beginning of honesty. The psyche cannot transform what it will not acknowledge. You are not broken because your empathy served unconscious needs. You are human. The work is not to eliminate these patterns, but to bring them into consciousness where choice becomes possible. Third, there arrives a disturbing revelation about the shadow material you have been projecting onto others. Projection, as I came to understand through analytical work, is the psyche's way of encountering parts of itself it cannot yet own directly. What you see in others, the narcissists, the takers, the energy vampires, these are often carriers of your own disowned material. The narcissist you attract represents the healthy self-love you have forbidden yourself. The taker embodies the permission to receive you have never granted yourself. The energy vampire mirrors the ways you deplete your own resources through constant self-sacrifice. You have organized your identity around being the opposite of these traits, and so the unconscious compensates by surrounding you with individuals who embody them in exaggerated form. I recall a woman who came to me exhausted from what she called an endless parade of selfish partners. Each relationship followed the same pattern. Initial fascination with someone who seemed confident and self-assured, followed by growing resentment as she discovered they expected her to accommodate their needs without reciprocation. She could not understand why she kept attracting the same type of person despite her awareness of the pattern. What emerged through our work was that she had split off entirely her own capacity for healthy selfishness. Raised by a depressed mother, she learned early that her needs were burdensome, that her value resided in her ability to be easy, accommodating, and self-sufficient. The anger she felt at this injustice had no place to go, and so it descended into the shadow where it calcified into a deep, unconscious rage. The narcissistic partners she attracted were not random. They were the psyche's attempt to show her what she had disowned, the capacity to prioritize herself, to state needs without apologizing, to receive without earning. But because she could only encounter these qualities through projection, she experienced them as persecutory. The narcissists became villains in her story, and she remained the victim, never having to confront her own forbidden desires for recognition and care. Until you withdraw these projections, until you acknowledge that what you despise in others lives also in you, the pattern will continue. The unconscious will keep presenting the same lesson in different forms until consciousness finally turns to meet it. This is not pleasant work. The ego resists discovering that it shares qualities with those it has judged. But individuation requires the integration of opposites. You cannot become whole while half of yourself remains in darkness. The fourth stage manifests as a crisis of identity when boundaries first appear. For years, perhaps decades, you have functioned without clear demarcation between self and other. Your skin has been permeable, your emotional body an extension of the collective field. To suddenly assert a boundary, to say no, to withdraw your energy, to stop managing others' emotions, this feels not like self-preservation, but like cruelty. The psyche operates through compensation, and when one side has been inflated for too long, the corrective movement can feel extreme. The first boundaries you attempt to set may emerge as walls rather than membranes. You may swing from total openness to complete shutdown, from absorbing everything to feeling nothing. This is the pendulum finding its center. Do not be alarmed by the intensity of your initial movements toward self-protection. What became clear through years of analytical work is that the empath's resistance to boundaries stems from a deep, often unconscious belief that separation equals abandonment. The child who survived by attunement learned that disconnection threatened survival. To stop feeling what mother felt, to close off from father's rage, to protect yourself from the emotional chaos of your environment, this would have left you alone in ways the young psyche could not bear. And so you remained open, absorbing, feeling everything, believing this was love. But the unconscious now demands something different. It demands that you discover the boundary between compassion and enmeshment, between sensitivity and self-abandonment. When you set a boundary and anxiety floods your system, this is not evidence that the boundary was wrong. This is the old survival pattern activating, insisting that connection requires self-erasure. Sit with the discomfort. Notice where in your body the panic lives. Observe the thoughts that arise, the catastrophic predictions, the guilt, the certainty that you have harmed someone through your refusal to accommodate. These are not truths. These are the ego's defense against transformation. The boundary itself begins the work. You need not understand it fully. You need not justify it. The simple act of saying no and tolerating the anxiety that follows creates new neural pathways, new possibilities for relating. What emerges fifth is the capacity to witness suffering without requiring yourself to fix it. This is perhaps the most challenging stage, for it demands that you distinguish between empathy and responsibility. You can feel another's pain without making it your task to eliminate it. You can recognize suffering without believing your worth depends on your ability to rescue. The individuation process, as I came to understand, requires that each person carry their own darkness. When you intervene prematurely, when you rush to soothe or solve, you rob the other of the opportunity for growth. The descent into suffering is often the psyche's way of forcing consciousness to confront what has been avoided. Your rescue, compassionate as it seems, may be an interruption of necessary psychological work. This does not mean you become callous or indifferent. It means you learn to hold space for pain without needing to transform it. You develop the capacity to say, I see you struggling, and I trust that you have the resources to move through this. You discover that true compassion sometimes looks like allowing another to face their own darkness, rather than illuminating it for them prematurely. When someone you care for is suffering and you do not rush to fix it, notice what happens inside you. The anxiety that rises, the compulsion to act, the sense that your inaction makes you cruel. These are the ego's attachments, not your true nature. The self, in its wisdom, knows that suffering serves purposes the conscious mind cannot see. It knows that the breakdown often precedes the breakthrough, that the dark night cannot be bypassed through comfort. Practice sitting with another's pain without absorbing it. When they speak their suffering, resist the urge to offer solutions. Simply listen, breathe, allow the discomfort of bearing witness without rescue. This is the development of genuine empathy, the capacity to feel with rather than feel for, to accompany rather than to save. It is harder than rescuing. It requires more strength to hold space than to fill it with your own activity. But it is the only path to relationships based on equality rather than dependency. The sixth movement reveals itself when you discover that your sensitivity was never the problem. What you have called a curse, what you have blamed for your exhaustion and boundary violations, was never your enemy. The problem was not the feeling, it was the unconscious belief that feeling required action, that too, perceived suffering obligated you to eliminate it. Depth psychology reveals that sensitivity is simply heightened perception. It is the ability to detect subtle energies, unconscious communications, the emotional undercurrents others miss. This capacity, in itself, is neutral. It becomes problematic only when paired with the compulsion to manage what you perceive. The empath who learns to feel without fixing, to perceive without taking responsibility, discovers that sensitivity transforms from burden into gift. You begin to recognize that you can notice someone's anxiety without absorbing it. You can perceive anger without believing it targets you. You can sense sadness in a room without making it your task to shift the atmosphere. The sensitivity remains, but the unconscious merging dissolves. You develop what might be called conscious boundaries, the ability to maintain separateness while remaining open. This stage often brings relief so profound it feels like remembering something long forgotten. You realize that you were never meant to carry the collective emotional field. You were never designed to serve as emotional processor for everyone you encounter. The exhaustion you felt was not the price of sensitivity. It was the cost of unconscious enmeshment. Consider the tree that feels every shift in wind but does not believe it must control the weather. The tree bends, yes, but it does not exhaust itself trying to still the air. It responds to what is without taking responsibility for what is. This is the empowered empath, deeply feeling, highly attuned, but rooted in a sense of self that remains distinct even while relating. When you no longer identify as victim of your sensitivity, when you stop believing that your depth obligates you to carry others' darkness, something new becomes possible. You discover that you can be moved by suffering without being destroyed by it. You can offer genuine help, help that emerges from overflow rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion. This is the beginning of sustainable compassion. The final stage arrives when victimhood dissolves and something altogether different takes its place. This is not about becoming invulnerable or developing the thick skin you once believed you lacked. It is about recognizing that the power you sought outside yourself, in others' validation, in being needed, in proving your worth through service, this power was always internal, always available, simply waiting for consciousness to turn and claim it. The victim position, comfortable as it became, served a purpose the ego could not acknowledge. It allowed you to remain innocent. If you were the one harmed, the one drained, the one who gave while others took, then you need never confront your own capacity for harm, for taking, for self-interest. The victim is morally pure, psychologically simple, and perpetually powerless. This simplicity has its appeal. It absolves you of responsibility for your life. But the unconscious will not permit this position indefinitely. It creates crisis after crisis, exhaustion upon exhaustion, until consciousness has no choice but to turn and face the question it has been avoiding. What would it mean to step into your power? Not power over others, not dominance or control, but the simple, terrifying sovereignty of a psyche that knows its own worth, states its own needs, and refuses to abandon itself for approval. This transformation does not happen through affirmations or willpower. It happens through the slow, often painful work of shadow integration. Each time you recognize your unconscious motivations without self-punishment, each time you withdraw a projection and own what you have disowned, each time you set a boundary and survive the anxiety, you retrieve a fragment of power you had given away. The archetypal forces at work here are ancient: the hero's journey, the descent and return, the transformation through ordeal. What presents as personal suffering is your participation in a pattern as old as consciousness itself. You are not broken. You are not flawed. You are moving through the stages of individuation, and the pain you feel is the friction of growth, the necessary discomfort of a psyche expanding beyond its previous limitations. From this new vantage point, you see that the power was never absent, only unconscious. The strength you attributed to others, the sovereignty you believed you lacked, the capacity to honor your own needs without guilt, all of this lived in you, waiting in the shadow for consciousness to turn and claim it. The journey from victim to victor is the journey from unconsciousness to awareness, from projection to integration, from self-abandonment to self-possession. You who listen now understand what could not be understood from the victim position. You see that your empathy, your sensitivity, your capacity to feel deeply, these were never the problem. The problem was the unconscious patterns that shaped how you related to these gifts. The problem was the belief that feeling required fixing, that perception demanded action, that your worth resided in your usefulness to others. What becomes possible now is a different relationship to your sensitivity. You can feel without merging. You can perceive without absorbing. You can care deeply while maintaining the boundary between self and other. This is not coldness. This is the maturity that comes when the psyche learns to hold opposites: openness and protection, compassion and sovereignty, connection and autonomy. The relationships you form from this place will look different from those you knew before. You will no longer attract endless rescuers and victims, for you will have withdrawn the projections that drew them. You will find instead those who meet you as equal, who honor both your depth and your boundaries, who do not require you to abandon yourself to love them. The pattern breaks not because you have changed others, but because you have changed the unconscious position from which you relate. When someone attempts to engage you in the old dance, the crisis that demands rescue, the emotional dumping that expects absorption, the boundary violation disguised as intimacy, you will recognize it immediately. Not with judgment, but with clarity. You will feel the old pull, the familiar compulsion to step in and manage. And then you will choose differently, not because you have become cold, but because you have become whole. The practical work continues. Each day presents opportunities to practice the new patterns, to notice when you begin to merge and gently return to yourself, to speak your truth even when anxiety rises, to allow others their own struggles without making them your responsibility. The transformation is not a single moment of insight, but 1,000 small choices, each one reinforcing the new neural pathways, each one strengthening the capacity for conscious relating. You stand now at the threshold of a different way of being, one that honors both depth and sovereignty. The sensitivity you carry is not a curse to be managed, but a gift to be refined. When paired with clear boundaries, with shadow awareness, with the capacity to feel without fixing, your empathy becomes something powerful, genuine compassion that emerges from wholeness rather than woundedness. The journey from victim to victor is not about eliminating vulnerability or developing invulnerability. It is about discovering that you can be both sensitive and strong, both open and boundaried, both feeling and self-possessed. These are not opposites to be reconciled, but complementary aspects of a psyche moving toward integration. What you once called weakness, your capacity to feel deeply, to perceive subtly, to be moved by suffering, this was never weakness at all. It was untrained strength, unrefined power, unopened potential. The work was never to eliminate your sensitivity. The work was to pair it with consciousness, to combine feeling with discernment, to unite empathy with sovereignty. You see now that the exhaustion was never inevitable. The draining relationships were not your destiny. The chronic depletion was not the price of depth. These were symptoms of a psychological position you occupied unconsciously, and what was adopted unconsciously can be released consciously. The power you sought in being needed, you discover in being whole. The worth you pursued through service, you find in simple existence. The love you tried to earn through sacrifice, you allow yourself to receive through presence. This is the victory, not over others, not over your sensitivity, but over the unconscious patterns that kept you small and safe and suffering. The victor is simply the one who has claimed what was always theirs, who has integrated what was split, who has brought into light what dwelled in shadow. You do not become someone new. You become who you always were beneath the roles, the patterns, the protective positions. The path continues to unfold. There will be moments when the old patterns re-emerge, when crisis tempts you back into rescue, when the familiar exhaustion threatens to return. This is not failure. This is the spiral nature of growth. You meet the same lessons at deeper levels. You practice the same boundaries with greater consciousness. You refine the work again and again. Each time you choose differently, the new pattern strengthens. Each time you honor your own needs without guilt, sovereignty becomes more natural. You carry now what you could not carry from the victim position, the knowledge that your sensitivity is yours to steward, not others to exploit. The understanding that boundaries are not barriers to connection, but foundations for genuine intimacy. The recognition that you can feel everything and still be okay, that you can witness suffering without being destroyed by it, that you can love deeply without losing yourself entirely. This is not the end of the journey, but a new beginning. The first steps taken from a place of consciousness rather than compulsion, of choice rather than conditioning, of power reclaimed rather than power projected. What becomes possible from here you cannot yet fully see. But the psyche knows. The self, in its wisdom, has been guiding you toward this moment all along. The exhaustion was the call. The pattern was the teacher. The pain was the initiation. You are ready now, not because the work is complete, but because consciousness has turned to face what was hidden. The victim dissolves not through force, but through recognition, not through rejection, but through integration. What remains is something simpler and more true, a human being learning to honor both depth and boundary, sensitivity and strength, connection and self. This is the victory. This is the power you always carried. This is who you are becoming, whole,